The crystal whiskey tumbler trembled in Richard Whitman's manicured hands as he gazed out from his Park Avenue penthouse windows at the Manhattan skyline that had once belonged to him. Just 6 months prior, his net worth had stood at a commanding $12 million, a fortune that positioned him among New York's financial aristocracy. Now, with nothing but the last $200 tucked into his tailored jacket pocket, he was preparing to flee the very city that had made his family's name synonymous with American success. His only crime? Underestimating Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. And Bumpy Johnson had just proven that even millionaires could be destroyed. The March evening of 1961, when it all began, had seemed so ordinary, so perfectly orchestrated according to the social rituals that governed Manhattan's upper echelon. Richard Whitman, at 45, embodied everything that post-war America celebrated in its business leaders. Standing 6 feet tall with silver-touched temples and the confident bearing of inherited wealth, he represented the third generation of Whitmans to shape New York's financial landscape. His family had arrived from England in the 1840s, building their fortune through strategic investments in railroads, steel mills, and eventually the stock market itself. Wright and Associates. The investment firm Richard had inherited and modernized occupied 3 floors of a prestigious Madison Avenue building. The company's client roster read like a who's who of American power: Rockefeller family trusts, pharmaceutical fortunaires, Hollywood moguls seeking tax shelters, and European nobility looking to diversify their centuries-old wealth into American markets. Richard's Harvard Business School education and Yale law degree had merely polished the business acumen that flowed through his bloodline like blue ink on bond paper. His personal empire stretched across the 5 boroughs like a carefully planned chess game. The 4-story Park Avenue penthouse, inherited from his father, featured hand-carved marble imported from Italian quarries and oil paintings acquired during European grand tours. His East Hampton estate, a sprawling 20-acre compound, hosted summer gatherings where senators, Supreme Court justices, and Fortune 500 CEOs discussed policy over aged bourbon and Cuban cigars. 3 office buildings in Manhattan's financial district generated steady rental income from law firms and banking institutions. Brooklyn's waterfront docks, purchased during the Depression when prices were low, now processed millions of dollars in international cargo. The Queens manufacturing facilities produced precision instruments for both civilian and military applications, benefiting from lucrative government contracts that Richard's political connections had secured. But Richard Whitman possessed a fatal character flaw that his Harvard professors had never addressed in their case studies. An arrogance so profound, so deeply rooted in assumptions of racial and social superiority, that it blinded him to the complex power structures actually governing New York City. In Richard's worldview, success belonged exclusively to men who looked like him. White, Protestant, Ivy League educated, and born into families whose names appeared on hospital wings and library dedications. African Americans, in Richard's carefully constructed mental hierarchy, occupied service positions, chauffeurs, doormen, cleaning staff, and perhaps, if they were exceptionally gifted, middle management roles in companies owned by white men. The idea that a black man could wield genuine power, the kind that could threaten Richard's carefully built empire, seemed as impossible to him as gravity flowing upward. This toxic combination of wealth, social position, and racial prejudice would prove catastrophically expensive in the spring of 1961. March 15, 1961, arrived with the crisp promise of early spring, cherry blossoms beginning to bloom in Central Park, while Wall Street hummed with the energy of a bull market. That Wednesday evening, New York's social elite gathered in the Plaza Hotel's Crystal Ballroom for the Metropolitan Charity Foundation's annual fundraising gala. The event, ostensibly organized to support disadvantaged children throughout the city, had evolved into the season's most prestigious social gathering, a carefully choreographed display of wealth, philanthropy, and political influence. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across tables draped in ivory linen, where Manhattan's power brokers sat in their assigned social hierarchies. The Astors occupied Table 1, near the dais where Governor Nelson Rockefeller would deliver the evening's keynote address. Banking families held court at tables 2 through 5, their conversations a subtle blend of market analysis and political gossip. Corporate executives, real estate magnates, and old money socialites filled the remaining prime locations, their seating arrangements reflecting decades of careful social positioning. Richard Whitman's table, number 7, commanded an excellent view of both the stage and the room's entrance, a strategic position that allowed him to observe the evening's political undercurrents while being seen by everyone who mattered. Beside him sat his wife Patricia, elegant in a pearl gray Dior gown that had cost more than most families' annual income. Their children, Richard Jr. and Elizabeth, both attending prestigious boarding schools, flanked their parents with the practiced poise of children raised for public life. The remaining seats hosted Richard's business partners, the brilliant but ruthless Marcus Webb, whose mathematical genius had made Wright and Associates famous for its predictive market models, and the silver-haired diplomatic Thomas Crawford, whose connections to both political parties ensured the firm's influence regardless of electoral outcomes. The evening's program proceeded according to its refined schedule. A 7-course dinner prepared by the plaza's executive chef, featuring delicacies flown in from France and California wines selected by the hotel's sommelier. Polite conversations about market trends, political developments, and social obligations. A modest auction of luxury items, artwork, donated by prominent galleries, vacation packages to European destinations, and private dinners with celebrity chefs that allowed guests to display their wealth while supporting the foundation's nominal charitable mission. Richard felt perfectly content in this familiar environment. These were his people, his natural peer group, the social circle, where his opinions carried weight and his judgments shaped consensus. The fundraising speeches about helping inner-city youth seemed appropriately philanthropic without requiring any meaningful engagement with the communities supposedly being served. It was charity at a comfortable distance, writing checks large enough to generate tax benefits and social recognition while maintaining the racial and economic boundaries that preserved Manhattan's elite structure. At precisely 9:30 p.m., everything changed with the quiet opening of the Crystal Ballroom's main entrance. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped into the golden light. Johnson, 56 years old that evening, moved with the measured grace of a man who had survived nearly 4 decades in Harlem's most dangerous neighborhoods. His physical presence defied easy categorization, neither imposing nor diminutive. He possessed the lean build of someone who had known hunger in his youth, but now enjoyed prosperity earned through intelligence rather than inheritance. Gray had begun to silver his hair, and lines around his eyes spoke of countless late nights spent navigating the complex negotiations that kept Harlem's underground economy functioning. His attire that evening reflected a careful balance between respectability and understated power. The black tuxedo, tailored on Savile Row during a business trip to London, fit his frame perfectly without calling attention to its considerable cost. Diamond cufflinks caught the light subtly, expensive enough to signal prosperity but restrained enough to avoid appearing ostentatious. Italian leather shoes, handmade in Milan, completed an ensemble that could have belonged to any of the evening's wealthy attendees. But Johnson's true power lay not in his clothing or bearing. It resided in the 40 years of relationships, obligations, and carefully maintained influence that made him arguably the most powerful man in Harlem, and by extension, one of the most influential African Americans in New York City. Richard Whitman noticed Johnson's entrance, but his Harvard-trained mind immediately classified the newcomer according to his prejudiced assumptions. What business does that Negro have in the Crystal Ballroom? Richard thought, his mental categories unable to process the possibility that a black man might belong in this social stratum through legitimate achievement rather than service employment. Johnson had been invited by Michael Hartley, chairman of the Democratic Party's New York chapter and a shrewd politician who understood that Harlem's voting bloc could determine mayoral elections. Hartley's invitation represented more than symbolic inclusion. It acknowledged Johnson's genuine influence over economic and political decisions, affecting millions of New Yorkers. But the white guests at most tables, including Richard Whitman, interpreted Johnson's presence as either tokenism or an administrative error. As Johnson made his way across the ballroom toward Hartley's table, he exchanged brief greetings with several prominent attendees. A handshake with federal Judge William Morrison, who had grown up in Harlem before attending Columbia Law School. A respectful nod to Congresswoman Edith Whitfield, whose district included both Manhattan's financial center and Harlem's residential neighborhoods. A warm smile for Dr. Margaret Chen, the renowned surgeon whose hospital served patients regardless of their ability to pay. Richard watched these interactions with growing irritation. In his worldview, the evening's social order was being disrupted by someone who simply didn't belong. The fundraising gala existed to allow legitimate power brokers to conduct business while displaying their charitable intentions. Johnson's presence introduced an element that Richard couldn't control or predict, and Richard Whitman was accustomed to controlling every variable in his environment. Richard turned to his longtime friend and business associate Charles Morrison, senior partner at Morrison, Blackwell & Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious white shoe law firms. Morrison had served as Richard's legal counsel for over 15 years, navigating complex corporate acquisitions and political relationships with the skill of someone who understood how power truly functioned in New York City. "Charles," Richard whispered, his voice carrying the edge of someone unaccustomed to having his social expectations challenged, "who exactly is that Negro gentleman, and how did he gain entrance to this gathering?" Morrison followed Richard's gaze to Johnson, who was now engaged in what appeared to be a substantive conversation with Banking Commissioner Harold Foster about federal lending policies affecting urban development. Morrison's expression shifted uncomfortably, the look of someone who possessed information he would prefer not to share. "That's Ellsworth Johnson," Morrison replied carefully. "He's what you might call Harlem's unofficial mayor, runs several legitimate businesses, has significant influence over labor unions, and maintains relationships with both Democratic and Republican political figures." Richard's laugh carried the condescending tone of someone who believed his own prejudices represented objective reality. "Unofficial mayor of what? A few city blocks of tenements and jazz clubs? Charles? Surely you're not suggesting that this man operates in the same sphere of influence as the people in this room?" Morrison shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Having spent decades navigating New York's complex political landscape, he possessed a more nuanced understanding of how power actually functioned beyond the rarefied circles of old money and Ivy League connections. "Richard, I would strongly advise against underestimating Mr. Johnson. His influence extends far beyond what you might imagine. The longshoremen's union that handles cargo at your Brooklyn facilities, the Teamsters who transport goods to your Queens factories, the building service workers who maintain your Manhattan properties. Johnson has relationships with leadership across all these organizations." But Richard's worldview, constructed through 45 years of racial privilege and social insulation, couldn't accommodate Morrison's warning. In Richard's mental framework, genuine power flowed exclusively through established channels: corporate boardrooms, private clubs, political fundraising events, and social gatherings exactly like the one they were currently attending. The idea that a black man could wield influence capable of affecting Richard's business empire seemed as implausible as suggesting that janitors could dictate corporate policy. As the evening progressed, Richard's irritation intensified. Johnson moved through the ballroom with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in elite social settings, engaging in conversations that appeared substantial rather than merely polite. When Johnson spoke with Federal Reserve Board member Janet Richardson about monetary policy's impact on urban housing markets, Richard noticed that Richardson listened attentively, rather than offering the patronizing half-attention typically reserved for charity cases. When Johnson discussed infrastructure investment strategies with Transportation Secretary Marcus Williams, their conversation continued for nearly 10 minutes, the kind of extended dialogue reserved for peers whose opinions carried genuine weight. Most disturbing to Richard was the visible respect Johnson commanded from people whose judgment Richard had always trusted. These were serious individuals: federal judges, cabinet members, corporate executives, not the type to waste time on symbolic gestures or social tokenism. Yet they were treating Johnson as an equal, someone whose insights merited consideration and whose goodwill might prove valuable. At 10:45 p.m., as the evening's formal program was concluding and guests began moving toward the reception area for coffee and cordials, Johnson approached Richard's table. "Good evening," Johnson said. his voice carrying the cultured tones of someone educated at quality institutions. "I'm Ellsworth Johnson. I wanted to express my appreciation for the support everyone here has shown for Harlem's young people through tonight's fundraising efforts." The greeting was perfectly appropriate, even deferential in its acknowledgement of the guests' charitable contributions. A reasonable person would have responded with polite conversation, perhaps asking about Johnson's work in the community, or expressing interest in the programs being funded. Richard Whitman was not in that moment a reasonable person. Richard rose from his chair, but made no move to extend his hand in greeting. Instead, he looked Johnson up and down with the deliberate assessment of someone cataloging social infractions. When he finally spoke, his voice carried just enough volume to be heard clearly by everyone at his table and several neighboring tables. "Mr. Johnson," Richard began, his tone carrying the patronizing warmth of someone addressing a child who had wandered into an adult gathering, "Harlem is certainly fortunate to have advocates like yourself working to improve conditions there. Of course, we all understand that neighborhoods like Harlem depend entirely on the generosity and goodwill of those who create actual wealth in this city." The insult was carefully constructed, wrapped in language polite enough to provide deniability, while delivering its intended message with crystalline clarity. Richard was publicly categorizing Johnson as a charity case, someone whose presence was tolerated only through the benevolence of his social superiors. Patricia Whitman closed her eyes and took a deep breath, recognizing the warning signs of her husband's worst impulses. Morrison reached for Richard's arm, hoping to redirect the conversation before it escalated further. But Richard, emboldened by what he perceived as his natural authority in this setting, continued his verbal assault. "The real economic decisions that affect this city, Mr. Johnson, are made in boardrooms and corporate headquarters, by individuals with the education, experience, and frankly, the financial responsibility that comes with managing genuine wealth. Playing politics in Harlem might make someone feel important, but it doesn't actually create jobs, build businesses, or generate the tax revenue that funds the social programs your community requires." The crystal ballroom seemed to contract around their conversation, as if the room's very architecture was recoiling from the toxic social dynamics suddenly poisoning the atmosphere. Guests at nearby tables had stopped their own conversations, their attention drawn by the unmistakable tension radiating from Richard's increasingly aggressive tone. Johnson's expression remained perfectly composed, but something shifted in his eyes, a subtle calculation that Morrison, with his experience reading dangerous men in courtrooms and boardrooms, immediately recognized as a warning signal. "Mr. Whitman," Johnson replied, his voice maintaining its respectful tone, while carrying an undertone that suggested depths Richard was too prejudiced to perceive. "You're absolutely right that this city's economy depends on complex relationships between various interests. I've always been fascinated by how interconnected everything is. How the longshoremen who unload cargo at Brooklyn's ports depend on the shipping companies. How those companies depend on the manufacturers who produce goods. How those manufacturers depend on workers who live in neighborhoods throughout the city." This was Johnson's attempt to de-escalate the confrontation, while subtly demonstrating that his understanding of New York's economic ecosystem was far more sophisticated than Richard assumed. But Richard, intoxicated by his own sense of superiority and the audience of his social peers, interpreted Johnson's measured response as confirmation of his subordinate status. "Exactly my point," Richard declared, his voice rising as his inhibitions fell away. "The real wealth, the real power, the real decisions happen here." He gestured broadly at the opulent ballroom, encompassing the assembled crowd of Manhattan's elite. "Everything else, including whatever goes on in Harlem, exists at the margins. You might be a big fish in a very small pond, Mr. Johnson, but you're still swimming in a pond." The metaphor was both racially loaded and economically dismissive, reducing Johnson's influence to insignificance while asserting Richard's natural superiority. It was also, as events would soon demonstrate, catastrophically inaccurate. Johnson studied Richard for a long moment, his gaze carrying the weight of 4 decades spent navigating far more dangerous confrontations than a ballroom disagreement with an arrogant millionaire. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet enough that only Richard and those immediately nearby could hear them clearly. "Mr. Whitman, I think you may be surprised to discover just how large that pond actually is, and how many streams flow through it. But I hope you never have occasion to learn that lesson personally." With that, Johnson nodded politely to the other guests at the table, offered a brief word of thanks to Patricia Whitman for her lovely evening, and walked away toward the ballroom's exit. Richard watched Johnson's departure with a sense of profound satisfaction. In his mind, he had just demonstrated to New York's elite that he wouldn't be intimidated by social engineering or political correctness. He had put an upstart in his place using the kind of direct confrontation that had made America great. The approving nods from some guests and the nervous silence from others confirmed, in Richard's interpretation, that he had acted appropriately in defending the social order. Morrison, however, was already calculating the potential damage. "Richard," he said quietly, "you may have just made the worst mistake of your business career." "What mistake?" Richard replied, still flush with adrenaline from the confrontation. "I told that man exactly where he stands in this city's hierarchy. Someone needed to remind him that there are still boundaries. That man," Morrison said carefully, "controls more of this city's day-to-day operations than you realize. The unions that supply your labor, the trucking companies that move your goods, the service contractors who maintain your properties, the political figures who approve your permits, Johnson has relationships with all of them. You just publicly humiliated someone who could make your business life very difficult." But Richard's worldview couldn't accommodate Morrison's warning. In Richard's universe, real power flowed through legal contracts, corporate hierarchies, and financial instruments, systems controlled by people like himself. The idea that Johnson could threaten Wright and Associates using informal networks and personal relationships seemed absurd. "Charles, you're giving this man far too much credit. He may have some influence over street-level operations, but serious business operates through legitimate channels. We have contracts, legal protections, and political connections that no Harlem politician could overcome." Morrison shook his head. "Richard, I've been practicing law in this city for 30 years. I've seen how quickly things can change when the wrong person decides to make life difficult. Johnson isn't just some street politician, he's a sophisticated operator who understands systems you don't even know exist." Richard dismissed Morrison's concerns with the confident arrogance of someone who had never faced genuine adversity. His family's wealth had insulated him from consequence. His race had protected him from systemic discrimination, and his social position had shielded him from economic vulnerability. The possibility that a single black man could threaten his carefully constructed empire seemed not just unlikely, but philosophically impossible. The ride home to Park Avenue passed in relative silence. Patricia clearly upset by her husband's behavior, while Richard remained pleased with what he perceived as his principled stand. As their limousine glided through Manhattan's quiet streets, Richard mentally rehearsed the story he would tell at tomorrow's lunch meeting with his business partners. How he had faced down social pressure and refused to pretend that certain boundaries didn't exist. What Richard couldn't know, as he fell asleep in his silk pajamas between Egyptian cotton sheets, was that Johnson had spent the taxi ride back to Harlem making a series of phone calls to associates who controlled various pressure points throughout New York City's complex economic infrastructure. The education of Richard Whitman was about to begin, and the tuition would prove far more expensive than anything he had paid at Harvard or Yale. March 16, 1961, dawned with the deceptive tranquility of a spring morning in Manhattan. Richard Whitman followed his customary routine. A brisk workout in his private gymnasium, breakfast served by his housekeeper on bone china, inherited from his grandmother, and a review of the Wall Street Journal, while his chauffeur navigated morning traffic toward Wright and Associates headquarters. Everything appeared normal, orderly, and under his complete control. That illusion shattered the moment he stepped into his mahogany-paneled office. His secretary, Nancy Patterson, who had managed his professional life with Swiss precision for over a decade, appeared visibly distressed. Nancy, a capable woman in her 40s, who had earned Richard's trust through her discretion and efficiency, was not prone to emotional displays. Her current state of agitation sent immediate alarm through Richard's consciousness. "Mr. Whitman," she began, her usually steady voice trembling slightly, "we have several urgent situations requiring your immediate attention." The Brooklyn Longshoremen's Union has initiated a work stoppage at our facilities. No cargo is moving in or out. Additionally, our primary supplier for the Queens manufacturing operation has suspended all deliveries indefinitely. Richard felt his first stirring of genuine concern. The Brooklyn docks represented a crucial component of Wright and Associates' revenue stream, processing imported materials for several major clients. Any disruption there would cascade through multiple business relationships, potentially triggering penalty clauses in contracts worth millions of dollars. What reason did they give for the work stoppage? Richard demanded, his mind already calculating potential financial exposure. Union Representative Joseph Marconi said it was a temporary administrative issue. Nancy replied, consulting her notes. He wouldn't provide additional details, but he suggested the situation might resolve itself within a few weeks if certain misunderstandings were clarified. The phrasing struck Richard as odd. Joe Marconi had been his primary union contact for nearly 2 decades. Their relationship had always been professional and straightforward, with disagreements resolved through direct negotiation rather than work stoppages. Marconi's sudden vagueness suggested external pressure, but Richard couldn't immediately identify the source. Richard spent the morning attempting to understand the situation through phone calls to his usual contacts. Every conversation followed a similar pattern. Apologetic explanations, vague references to administrative complications, and promises that matters might improve once certain issues were resolved. No one would specify exactly what those issues were, but the coordinated nature of the responses suggested a deliberate campaign. By noon, the scope of the problem had expanded dramatically. Anthony Castellano, who had supplied raw materials to Wright and Associates' Queens facilities for 15 years, called to announce the temporary suspension of all deliveries. The cleaning company responsible for maintaining Richard's 3 Manhattan office buildings cited staffing shortages in canceling their contract. 2 major clients, citing concerns about operational reliability, postponed significant projects that would have generated substantial fees. Richard's initial confusion was evolving into genuine alarm. These weren't random business complications. They represented a coordinated effort to pressure his operations. But the sophistication required to orchestrate such widespread disruption suggested an adversary with far more influence than Richard had imagined possible. The next morning brought a visit from Internal Revenue Service auditors, requesting a comprehensive review of Wright and Associates' financial records for the previous 3 years. While the IRS maintained that this was a routine audit, Richard's accounting team noted that such extensive reviews were typically triggered by specific complaints or irregularities. The timing seemed suspiciously convenient for someone seeking to maximize pressure on the company. That afternoon, city inspectors arrived to examine fire safety protocols in Richard's Manhattan properties. Their inspection uncovered numerous violations that previous inspectors had somehow missed, requiring immediate and expensive remediation. The building department followed up with notices questioning several permits that had been properly obtained and maintained for years. As the week progressed, the pattern of harassment became undeniable. Every aspect of Richard's business empire was experiencing simultaneous difficulties. Union problems, supplier cancellations, client departures, regulatory scrutiny, and municipal harassment were occurring with precisely the kind of coordination that required extensive planning and influence. Richard finally understood that he was facing an adversary far more powerful than his prejudices had allowed him to recognize. But his pride still prevented him from accepting the obvious explanation for what was happening. On Thursday evening, Richard's phone rang at his Park Avenue penthouse. The caller identified himself as a representative of Ellsworth Johnson, requesting a private meeting to discuss mutual business interests. The message was polite but carried an unmistakable undertone. Richard's current problems could be resolved through negotiation, but only if he was prepared to acknowledge realities his arrogance had previously obscured. Patricia Whitman, who had watched her husband's growing anxiety throughout the week, strongly urged him to accept the meeting. "Richard, your pride is destroying our family's security. This man is offering you a way out of this mess. Take it before you lose everything we've built." But Richard's worldview was constructed around the premise that he belonged to a superior social class that didn't negotiate with people like Johnson. Accepting a meeting would represent an acknowledgement of Johnson's power, an admission that Richard's assumptions about racial and social hierarchy were fundamentally incorrect. Instead, Richard decided to fight back through what he considered appropriate channels. He contacted federal law enforcement agencies, requesting investigations into Johnson's activities. FBI agents politely explained that they had no active cases involving Johnson and suggested that Richard contact local authorities if he believed crimes were being committed. NYPD detectives offered similar responses. Johnson wasn't currently under investigation, and the business disruptions Richard was experiencing appeared to involve legitimate commercial decisions rather than criminal activity. Richard's corporate attorneys delivered equally disappointing news. While Johnson's message had clearly implied responsibility for the coordinated business problems, he hadn't made any explicit threats that could support legal action. The various unions, suppliers, and contractors were technically free to make their own business decisions, even if those decisions appeared coordinated. Proving conspiracy would require evidence that none of Richard's legal advisors could identify. By the end of March, Wright and Associates was hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate. The company's cash reserves, built up over decades of steady profits, were depleting rapidly as operational costs continued, while revenue streams dried up. Richard's personal fortune, much of which was tied up in company stock and real estate investments, was declining in value as potential buyers learned about the firm's operational difficulties. The psychological pressure was taking an equally devastating toll. Richard had spent his entire adult life believing that his wealth, education, and social connections made him essentially untouchable. The discovery that a man he had dismissed as irrelevant could systematically dismantle his empire challenged fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. On April 2nd, exactly 3 weeks after the Plaza Hotel confrontation, Richard finally called the number Johnson's representative had provided. The meeting took place at Small's Paradise, a legendary Harlem jazz club that had hosted everyone from Duke Ellington to visiting European royalty. For Richard, entering this establishment represented his first meaningful venture into Harlem, a neighborhood he had previously known only through stereotypes and prejudiced assumptions. The club's sophisticated atmosphere, with its Art Deco design and well-dressed clientele, challenged his expectations about what existed beyond Manhattan's elite enclaves. Johnson was waiting in a corner booth, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that would have been appropriate at any Wall Street boardroom. His demeanor was courteous but businesslike, showing no trace of gloating over Richard's obvious desperation. "Mr. Whitman," Johnson began, "I appreciate your willingness to meet. I understand you've been experiencing some business challenges recently." Richard's impulse was to deny Johnson's obvious responsibility for his problems. But 3 weeks of financial hemorrhaging had stripped away his capacity for self-delusion. "Mr. Johnson, I believe you know exactly why I'm here. The question is what you want from me to make this stop." Johnson leaned back in his chair, studying Richard with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent decades negotiating with dangerous adversaries. "What I want, Mr. Whitman, is for you to understand something that your education apparently didn't teach you. Respect isn't something you can inherit or purchase. It's something you earn through how you treat other people. 3 weeks ago, you stood in front of New York's most influential business and political leaders and publicly declared that I was irrelevant. You suggested that my community was dependent on the charity of people like you. You demonstrated that you consider yourself racially and socially superior to me and everyone I represent." Johnson paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "The problems you've been experiencing aren't revenge, Mr. Whitman. They're education. I wanted you to understand how interconnected this city really is, and how many people you consider irrelevant actually play crucial roles in your business operations." Richard felt his remaining pride crumbling as he grasped the sophistication of Johnson's response. This hadn't been a street-level retaliation. It had been a masterclass in economic warfare conducted with surgical precision. Johnson had identified every pressure point in Richard's business empire and applied exactly the right amount of force to create maximum impact without crossing legal boundaries. "What do you want me to do?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Johnson reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. "I want you to demonstrate that you've learned something from this experience. These are the terms that will allow your business operations to return to normal. Richard read through the list with growing amazement. Rather than demanding financial payments or personal humiliation, Johnson's requirements focused on structural changes that would force Richard to engage meaningfully with Harlem's community. Wright and Associates would establish a $500,000 scholarship fund for Harlem students pursuing business education. The company would create an internship program specifically designed to provide career opportunities for young people from underserved communities. Richard's construction projects would be required to use minority-owned subcontractors for at least 25% of their work. The firm's board of directors would add 2 African-American members within 6 months. Most significantly, Richard himself would need to spend time learning about Harlem's actual economic and social dynamics, rather than relying on the prejudiced assumptions that had guided his previous thinking. These requirements will cost my company approximately $2 million over the next 5 years. Yes, Johnson replied calmly. And if you had approached me with respect 3 weeks ago, instead of arrogance and prejudice, none of those costs would have been necessary. The price of ignorance, Mr. Whitman, is always higher than the cost of education. Richard signed the agreement that evening, understanding that he had no realistic alternative. But as Wright and Associates operations gradually returned to normal over the following weeks, he began to recognize something unexpected. Johnson's requirements were actually improving his business rather than damaging it. The scholarship program attracted positive publicity that brought new clients interested in working with socially responsible firms. The internship program provided access to talented young people who brought fresh energy and perspectives to the company's operations. Partnerships with minority contractors opened opportunities in markets Richard had never previously considered. The diverse board members contributed insights that led to profitable investments in emerging neighborhoods throughout the city. Within 18 months, Wright and Associates was generating more revenue than ever before in its history. Richard's personal fortune had not only recovered, but grown substantially. The company's reputation for social responsibility attracted high-profile clients who valued progressive business practices. More importantly, Richard's understanding of New York City had been fundamentally transformed. His forced education about Harlem's community revealed a complex ecosystem of entrepreneurs, intellectuals, artists, and professionals whose achievements had been invisible to him only because of his own prejudiced assumptions. His interactions with Johnson's associates introduced him to African-American business leaders, political figures, and community organizers whose sophistication and capability exceeded that of many people in his previous social circle. The relationship between Richard and Johnson evolved from hostility through grudging respect to genuine friendship. Johnson became an informal advisor to Richard's business operations, providing insights about urban development and community relations that proved invaluable. When Johnson died in 1968, Richard was among the prominent white business leaders who attended his funeral, recognizing the passing of someone who had changed not just his fortune but his fundamental understanding of justice and equality. In 1975, 14 years after their initial confrontation, Wright and Associates was valued at over $50 million, more than 4 times its worth, before Richard met Johnson. The company's success had been built not despite its commitment to social responsibility, but because of it. Richard Whitman Jr., now managing partner of Wright and Associates, often tells visitors about the night in 1961, when his father's arrogance nearly destroyed the family business, and how a Harlem leader's wisdom ultimately saved and transformed it. "My father learned that real power doesn't come from looking down on other people," he explains. "It comes from lifting them up." That lesson, taught by Ellsworth Johnson, became the foundation of everything our company achieved afterward. The story of Richard Whitman and Bumpy Johnson remains a powerful reminder that in America's greatest city, no one succeeds alone, and everyone deserves respect regardless of their background or neighborhood. Those who forget that lesson do so at their own peril,